Thank you very much for having us. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about slow food here in the UK. I think there's a lot of potential to do some really good things, and I'm actually involved with Transition Leicester, who are really active. They've got their own community garden, permaculture courses, they've got a sustainability fair coming up, and so coming from slow food, I'm trying to bring these two things together. And thanks again for the opportunity. So many of you here probably have heard of slow food as a movement in general, but maybe you're not all aware that slow food is actually an association born in 1989 in Bra, in northern Italy, as Franco was saying. With the aim, it was born to counter the rise of fast food and fast culture, and stop the loss of traditional foods and everything that is linked to that. But over the years, we can definitely say that the aims of the association have definitely changed. So in the beginning, slow food was more about preserving local food traditions and gastronomy. And still today, many people have an image of slow food as a gastronomic club, a dining club. But over the years, things have really changed, and slow food is now involved in campaigns on agricultural food biodiversity, on land grabbing, on animal welfare most recently, GMOs, fishing sustainability, and does a lot of work on food education, both with children but also with adults. So the key words that really sum up what slow food as an association is about is good, clean, and fair. These are the three words that guide slow food all the time. So when we say good food, slow food says that food should taste good. And slow food talks about the right to pleasure, that the right to good food should be a right for everybody, which can sometimes be considered a bit controversial, but I think it's really innovative and let's say particular for an association. So food should be good, it should be healthy, it should be seasonal, it should be local. So there is a strong attention to local food traditions and local economies and everything that surrounds that. Clean, it has to be sustainable, so environment, once again, seasonal and local. And fair for the farmers, that they get the right price for the food that they are selling. Fair also in terms of animal welfare. And a lot of work is also done on the question of food prices. Today we spend far too little on the food that we buy. And one of the criticisms which is often which people often criticize about slow food is that it is elitist, because slow food says we should be spending more money for the food we eat. But I think that's really fair, because if we're spending £1 for a big piece of meat, you have to think about how that animal was raised, the repercussions on the environment, and especially on health. If you look at obesity and all of the fast food shops that are around here, we've really got to think about food more holistically. So in practical terms, to tell you more about the structure of slow food and also of Terra Madre, I'll get to that later. Slow food has 100,000 members in over 150 countries. And with the Terra Madre network, that goes up to 170 countries. And it's organized in local chapters. There are some local chapters in the UK as well of slow food, although the association isn't particularly strong here. And the local chapters members organize lots of different events. It depends really on their creativity. They might organize taste education initiatives, or visits to farmers, or seminars and conferences, or help set up farmers markets, for instance. But it really is a grassroots organization. The headquarters, as I was saying, are in Bra in northern Italy. It's where I worked for 2 years. And it really is, for a northern Italian town, it is a very strange place because there are people from all over the world, and it really is a very small town, and lots of young people really determined, and there are so many people just working on really interesting and stimulating projects. So really, the idea that it is associated with a dining club or something elitist, just when you come to Bra and you see the people that are behind it working in the offices, but and then the grassroots movement as well, you really see that it's very different, actually. There are about 6 or 7 national structures. Also in the UK, there is one in the US, Switzerland, Japan, and so on. And the work of Slow Food International, of the actual headquarters, focuses on 3 main areas: food biodiversity, education, and Terra Madre. Concerning biodiversity, Slow Food has a number of projects called Presidia and Arc of Taste. Essentially, they are projects about forgotten foods. And what Slow Food aims to do is provide direct support to producers of products that would otherwise be risking extinction. One of these products, for instance, is, since I'm in Leicester, Spark and Hoe Red Leicester. There's, I think, one last artisanal producer of Spark and Hoe Red Leicester. But Red Leicester is everywhere, but the actual Red Leicester made with raw milk cheese, if we don't support it...
It's totally different from...
it's good. The taste is just completely different. And if we don't support these producers, we're going to lose them. So Slow Food does a lot of work on that. And actually, at the leaflets, you can see there's a booklet called Slow Food Presidia. And you'll find a list of all of these products, of all of these projects that we're supporting around the world. Currently, there are about 500, but the aim is to make it much bigger. It's just a question of resources, really. Biodiversity. Other projects involving biodiversity, I can't list them all because there's really a lot going on. There was recently a 1,000 Gardens in Africa initiative where Slow Food helped set up 1,000 vegetable gardens in schools, in local communities. But not just any vegetable garden. There are strict rules. They have to be using plants, local, native, indigenous plants, because they each serve a function, in the area that they're from. Concerning food education, which is one of the primary objectives of Slow Food, there are 2 separate areas. One of the focuses is bringing consumers and producers together. In fact, Slow Food talks about the fact that we should all be co-producers because consumption is just the final act of the production chain. So to do this, Slow Food supports, has set up earth markets. So they're farmers markets, but with very strict criteria. So there has to be the producer at the market that meets the consumer and can interact. And so it's also about building that relationship of trust, which we have lost. And the Horsemeat Scandal just underlines that, completely. So we have the earth markets, for instance. In 2004, Slow Food set up a university. And it's called the University of Gastronomic Sciences, which is located near where the headquarters are. But it's not, once again, just somewhere where people learn to cook. It's a place where students learn about all aspects of food. So from a holistic perspective, they study history, they study anthropology, they study economics, they study biology. They study everything about food. So if you're interested, please go on slowfood.com. You'll find all the information there. And there are students from all over the world, from Ethiopia even, from the US, and they all go back to their own country and do really cool things concerning food. And one of the other areas that Slow Food focuses on is the events where food education is concerned. So we have 3 main events, which are Slow Fish, so on fish and sustainability, cheese, which is held in September. It's my favorite. It's amazing. It's in Bra, and it's on supporting small-scale producers, of course, who make raw milk artisan cheeses. And then there's the Salone del Gusto in Terra Madre, which takes place every 2 years in Turin. And aside from being a big market, so where you have the small-scale producers from the projects, which I mentioned before, the Presidia, there's also Terra Madre. And Terra Madre is complicated, but Terra Madre is a big network of farmers, of students, of activists, of academics, of chefs, of all people involved in good, clean, and fair food production from all over the world. So it's a huge network present in 170 countries. And every 2 years, they come together in Turin. And the short film that I'll be showing you after Geoff's speech is a journey into Terra Madre, because it really is an incredible experience. You can only understand it fully if you're there. I mean, you meet the shaman from the Brazilian Amazon, for instance, that will talk about, the problems that he's facing, or the farmer in India, or from Italy or Germany, and they all come together, and they don't have the same specific problems, but meeting for them is really important, because every day in their local communities they're fighting against the system, and they often feel very isolated and alone. So when they come to Turin and they attend the seminars or they meet, they can confront each other and really leave with lots more hope and a lot of energy, because they see that their work is really appreciated, and there are people that face the same problems. So that is just a very brief overview of what Slow Food does, and I'm really happy to answer any of your questions afterwards, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of things to add. I'd like to pass the word to Geoff now, and yes.
Thanks, thanks, Anne-Marie, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak at Taking Soundings meeting. I was on the Soundings editorial board for a while, the journal, which I think this has a close, loose relationship with this group, until I started travelling in Italy and I had to stop, and it was a shame, because to listen to Stuart Hall and Doreen Massey in full flow was political education. I see slow food as very much a political movement, and that was my interest, really, writing about Italy, wanting an alternative to Silvio Berlusconi, and I found it in slow food. But I think the British left, in particular, is slow to recognise the politics of food. You want an indication of rising inequality, just look at the numbers of food banks that are spiralling at the moment in Britain, and many other examples of where food, is a way of understanding contemporary politics. If you think about the environment, health, diet, you get an understanding of where the country's going. And the Horsemeat Scandal is a very good example, I think. It really illustrates in many ways what is wrong with contemporary capitalism. I think some on the left who dismiss it as a sort of fussy consumers are quite wrong on this. For example, the need to pursue profit in all cases, cutting corners, ineffective regulation. This is an industrial food system that's spiraling out of control, in my view. A cheap food economy. What are the costs of keeping this food system going, and who's on the receiving end of this? It seems, people on low-income groups. The government, meanwhile, is playing catch-up. Every day something is being disclosed. They don't know what's going on. And I think, the politics of food are really at the core of our contemporary economy and politics, and we need to think more about the implications of that. We're all entitled, as Anne-Marie said, I think we're all entitled to good food, not posh food, but real food. Food that Michael Pollan, the American food writer, once said that your grandmother would recognize as food. That's real food, okay? It's not posh food, it's real food. And the whole question of, the Horsemeat Scandal has taken away that. We don't know what's in the food. Nobody knows where it's going to turn up next. And incidentally, I've eaten horse meat in Sicily, and it's delicious. But the difference was it was on the menu, and it was a local food tradition. Don't expect it in my lasagna. So slow food is really about this kind of politics. I first encountered slow food in 2001 in Genoa at the G8 conference. Some of you may remember the big anti-globalization movement protest. In fact, the city was militarized. I never got to know the city until I went back about 4 years later to Slow Fish. But it is a beautiful city. But I saw a banner on the Genoa demonstrations. I think it was Lucca Slow Food, city in Tuscany. And it's the first I'd seen of it, and I wanted to know more. So I went to visit Bra and interviewed Carlo Petrini. I've got a long-standing interest in the Italian left. And it seemed to me also that slow food was, depressingly, in the years of Berlusconi, what was left to the Italian left. And when I visited Petrini, had a strong, identified strongly with his politics quite early on. The story is very interesting. I'm going to tell you a bit about the story. It's a movement which has its roots in the 1970s social movements. Carlo Petrini is a native of Bra, the town where Anne-Marie and myself lived for a short time. It's a very small town in Piemonte with 20,000 people. He was he was an activist in the 1970s in a group, PDUP, which is the Party of Proletarian Unity, which was to the left of the Italian Communist Party. People remember that. And it was interesting because he took a position at the time which was against the historic compromise. The PCI, of course, was in favour of that. And Petrini and his comrades, several of whom, including Anne-Marie's boss in the press office, were also members of this group. They've remained in the organisation of Slow Food in Bra. And Petrini had this wider interest in his locality. He organised, for example, a folk music festival, Cantieuve, where in Piemonte they go around and literally sing for eggs in the farmhouses. That has some of its roots in slow food. And he was involved in Arci, which is the cultural association of the former Italian Communist Party, which organised very interesting groups on, it was a group called Arcigolo. It was the food wing of this cultural association, which also organised hiking, football, all kinds of other cultural politics. And he set up a group called in English is the Friends of Barolo. This is a region where the great red wines in Italy come from. And his argument was that Barolo should be available to everyone. You can see where the universal right of pleasure is coming from. And aided by the fact there are several Marxist communist wine producers in Italy, small wine producers. So, this is quite difficult to understand from Britain, where I think it was the food writer Bill, what's his name, who said the British idea of pleasure was a milky tea and a chocolate digestive, But anyway, this is rooted in this kind of left-wing politics. And Petrini then set up, associations that literally grew out of this small town and is in this network, and has become a global food movement in a real sense. If you go to Terra Madre, you'll see a video in a minute. It has members in 130 countries, more, I think, now. Really a global movement, and has an idea of globalization I'll come back to in a minute, and a very creative idea. Now, I think the initial inspiration came from a demonstration they held, around the time they held a demonstration outside the setting up the second McDonald's in Italy, the Spanish Steps in Rome, where the protesters had bowls of penne, this pasta, the creative. And a manifesto was written. I'm going to quote something from the Slow Food Manifesto, which was a critique, not just of fast food, but fast life, a way of living. We are enslaved by speed and have all succumbed to the same insidious virus. Fast life, which disrupts our habits, pervades the privacy of our homes and forces us to eat fast food. In the name of productivity, fast life has changed our way of being and threatens our environment and landscapes. So slow food is now the only progressive answer. It becomes a bit more quirky later on in manifesto. The culture of our times, not quirky, but in a nice way, the culture of our times rests on a false interpretation of industrial civilization. In the name of dynamism and acceleration, man invents machines to find relief from work, but at the same time adopts the machine as a model of how to live his life. Against those, and they're in the majority, we can't see the difference between efficiency and frenzy. That's quite an important distinction. You can't see the difference between efficiency and frenzy. We propose a healthy dose of sensual pleasures to be followed up with prolonged enjoyment. So, the universal right to pleasure, but a critique of a way of living. That's what makes it interesting as a political movement. It's a critique of an economy, a way of living, a holistic critique. And if you come from a Marxist tradition, you kind of recognize the links, I think, between the economy, politics, and a sort of industrial system. Terra Madre, as Anne-Marie said, is a coming together of producers and consumers. And it's quite unique, really. This is not a consumers' movement. I think it's quite important to recognize that. It tries to follow the whole cycle, where the food comes from, which makes it important in trying to understand things like the Horsemeat Scandal. It's about having an empathy for the producer. Where does the food come from? Having an empathy for different food traditions. One of the pernicious effects of supermarkets, not only do they sort of dominate the high streets and change the environment and so on, they impose a standardized food system. We made a BBC programme with the OU with the London food markets, and we found that Spitalfields is not a typical local market, obviously, but in Spitalfields, we found that the people going to the market were from the broadest range of ethnic groups and so on. And the supermarkets actually, although they claim to represent this sort of globalized world, they do so in a very particular way. They take away the identity, the connection to local food cultures. And I mean that in a global sense. Now, another way slow food is a political movement, I think, is the language it uses. Very interesting. It's an ideological movement, I think, and it uses very interesting languages. For example, it has this phrase, virtuous globalization, which is a critique of neoliberal globalization, that we should think about cooperation, exchange, and this is what Terra Madre is. It's an exchange of producers. So you'll find, bread makers from Russia literally talking to, bread makers from Britain. There's a very interesting bread producer, Andrew Whitley. He used to be a left-wing BBC producer who's become sort of reincarnated as an artisan bread maker. He gives this wonderful lecture on what's wrong with the British food system. It's very political talk, and is involved with a real bread campaign, which is trying to become as successful as a real ale campaign, which is, in my experience, one of the more, one of the lasting successful movements of the 1970s, which has become quite effective in a range of ways in lobbying, against the closure of pubs and so on. I think bread and beer is probably good for Britain in a way. It gives a sort of grassroots emphasis on food. Eco-gastronomy, which is another slow food idea, which obviously brings together the pleasures of food with environmental responsibility. So this is quite different from hedonistic, let's say, people, it's not just about gluttony. It's about, having some responsibility to the environment where the food comes from. The co-producer, as Anne-Marie said, it's a very interesting concept. I think it's quite a lot in slow food. I wrote an article once about Gramsci and slow food, and in fact talked to Petrini a bit about this. And it's interesting that if you're interested in Gramsci, there's a lot of hegemonic politics in slow food. In other words, there's a lot of the prefigurative idea of the left, which is that you have to create a consensus in the present for the future society. And Petrini uses the phrase utopia in a very creative way. He's not afraid of being called a utopian. In other words, if you change the way of living in your own circumstances, your own community, you can put on the agenda a bigger idea. And I think this is very much part of slow food's politics. It doesn't fit into orthodox social democratic gradual instrumentalism. You're not saying anything wrong with that, but it's a different concept of politics. The intellectuals of the earth, Petrini used this phrase, Gramsci has this phrase, organic intellectuals. It's almost like a literal use of that term. People who understand the land, knowledge, the knowledge that people have in their local communities, all it's been lost really, by the standardization of the food culture. Talk to producers, extraordinary range of experiences, anything from fishermen in Cornwall to people talking about Caribbean food in parts of Britain. I mean, there's great knowledge there that's very important in the way in which you want to make, progressive social change. And good, clean and fair, which is a very effective slogan, rallying. It matches this idea, clean because it's environmentally friendly, fair, which is a just wage to the producer, a question of social justice. So that's all I want to say really at this point, just to say that slow food is not a nostalgic return to the past. In the offices in Bra, where Anne-Marie was working, I was just having long lunches when I was there, writing the book. But she was working there. And it's full of young people, young women who are in leading positions in slow food. And it now has, of course, as an international office and has this university nearby. And it's changed, the nature of the town. And I think slow food is the second biggest employer in the town. So it's had even a local effect on the local economy. I think that it's particularly strong. I ought to say a bit more about this. When I was writing my book, I went to 10 countries. Slow food has a presence in 130. I went to 10. And the ones that stand out for me were the US, where it's really has strong roots to the 1960s, countercultural. In the US, they understand what a fast food nation is. Every nook and cranny of American society, as Eric Schlosser said. They understand what a cheap food economy is and the effect that has on health. And there are many interesting food movements in the US, strong links to the 1960s, that come to Terra Madre every 2 years. And they organised an event, Slow Food Nation, a couple of years ago that I went to. And it was very, very political. It's more ideologically polarised in a way in the US than it is, let's say, over here. But it's, representative of a growing, I think it reflects various crises going on in society about, environment, economy, and our own sort of lifestyles, really. Feeling of excess and wanting something, wanting quality, not just quantity. I mean, there's a lot going on, really. And Petrini, amongst all the other things he's done, is a very powerful speaker, has also put on the agenda the idea of the gastronome as a political subject. And I'll leave you with this, because I think it has some sort of relevance to the Horsemeat Scandal. And he doesn't apologise for being a gastronome. He says, I am a gastronome. No, not the glutton with no sense of restraint, whose enjoyment of food is greater the more plentiful and forbidden it is. No, not a fool who gives to the pleasures of the table and indifferent, who's given to the pleasures of the table and is indifferent to how the food got there. I like to imagine the hands of the people who grew it, transported it, processed it, and cooked it before it was served to me. And that seems to me is what the Horsemeat Scandal has brought home to us, that we've lost that connection with food. Thanks very much.
Thank you. There's this common perception when you talk to people about food. I don't talk to a lot of people about food, actually, because it really annoys me. It's time. People, I don't have enough time. And the reality about it, you could look at sort of different cultural and traditional cuisines. It really doesn't take 10 to 15 minutes to put a really nice meal together. Also, depending on where you are, people can't distinguish, and it was mentioned a lot, price and value. And especially in Britain, people associate quality with value, something that really riles me. That, you could literally whack up a Michelin star meal yourself if you were really interested. So anyhow, so the question is how can you create this sort of excitement, that for food within the UK, as you can see from the Terra Madre sort of example.
Right. Can we take maybe another couple of questions or comments, and then we.
I'm on the low income. I'm on the state benefits, and one of the things about the kind of the slow food culture, as it's kind of interpreted a lot in the UK, is it's specialist producers, it's expensive, it's at the higher end of the market. Now, for my sins, I kind of survive on supermarket bargain bins and the market, primarily the market for fruits and veg. But I've found that it is actually relatively easy to eat well on a low budget. Okay, I'm eating, industrially produced vegetables that have probably got a ton of pesticides and stuff on them. That's what I see as the main problem. But a lot of
fresh.
But a lot of people on low incomes are kind of it'll be the supermarket burgers with horse and who knows whatever other animals in there as well, which I find very interesting because I found the way round it is a much more vegetarian diet because that's cheaper. But basically, what I wanted to say, instead of rambling on, was how do you see the slow food movement in terms of a kind of equity with people on low incomes? In terms of kind of like improving the diets of those who are currently, many of them really have made themselves reliant on fast food and really awfully produced sort of convenient products like value burgers.
What is this movement doing about land reform and access to land for more people?
I'm Harriet Walsh, I work for the Permaculture Association. I'd be interested to know, well, sort of two things. Sort of ties in with what Lorna has said about the land reform. Is there any evidence to show that the slow food movement, permaculture, eco-agriculture, is actually making any headway at all, if you sort of balance it up on a percentage term with industrial agriculture? And the other thing, is slow food engaging at all at kind of governmental level in a lobbying way? It'd be interesting to hear about that. Because there's some sort of, there's a bit of that evolving in the UK that I'm aware of. It'd be nice to know what else is going on.
Okay.
One general point about the UK sort of slow food, the profile of slow food in the UK is problematic, I would say, from my experience. First of all, it doesn't have many members. Secondly, it's fair to say it's never shaken off an image of being, wealthy gourmets just talking about sipping good food and so on. This has been a particular problem in Britain. I wouldn't say the same thing elsewhere. For example, I was in Eastern Europe for the book, and it means something completely different. In countries, Transylvanian villages in Romania and Poland, where they're trying to rebuild, a food culture that's been lost for many years, and where slow food, also being threatened by, obviously, the fascination with fast food, it really means something to the local economy. I mean, something completely different. So there's that problem. The other thing is there are many food movements in Britain that are more active, I think, than slow food. It's fair to say that, the transition movement, for example, is not just about food, but it's very active. Sustain is an excellent organisation. The Alliance for Better Food and Farming, a lot of energy and creative projects. Sustain, the Soil Association does things. So slow food is not, is part of that. Perhaps has a distinctive role, probably yet to find it, I would say. So on the government, I'm sort of coming to things on the government thing, I don't think it has much. There have been attempts to lobby, and certainly when slow food was set up here, not so much, but a lot in Italy, where they regularly get, regional involvement, where slow food is treated very seriously, actually, by all political parties, not just on the left in Italy. It gets a lot of regional funding. And the President of the Republic opens Terra Madre, they've had... But, so in that sense, that's quite a good way. In the US, it's become, in some states, significant in a broader movement for soda tax, the kind of idea of taxing food. So that has impact there. And I say in Eastern Europe, it also part of food projects there. In Britain, a long way to go, I would say, on that one. Yeah, I mean, the EU question. Sorry, I want to ask you. You come in.
No, go ahead.
You give your version, and you can talk also about what's going on in the association. But I mean, I know that a lot of local food producers have had many arguments with the EU over anything from making cheese to to the big fisheries campaign that's been going on, and Petrini himself. But actually, coming back to the point about government policy, the Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall thing did have an effect on European policy. There's a very charismatic Indian chef based in Cornwall, who I would put in charge of Slow Food Britain Tomorrow, is my choice, called Sanjay Kumar, who led a campaign in defence of the British sardine to Brussels and interrogated at Slow Fish the European Fisheries Minister. I mean, he's somebody who has... So, there are but I think there's a space for giving a much higher profile to slow food. And I think, yes, they need to have a stronger government voice, I think. I mean, that's the reality. Interestingly, CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, does have quite a good lobbying structure now. So lots of scope.
You asked the question about bringing together slow food values and people with low incomes.
Yeah.
It's basically, what you said that you do, growing things in our own gardens. And well, just one of the important things is slow food doesn't necessarily advocate for organic food. Of course, that is desirable, but it makes no sense to have organic food shipped all the way from Brazil, for instance. So definitely it would be about eating much less meat and going to the market. Like, unfortunately, I go to the market in Italy. It's normal. You go to the market and there you have the best choice of vegetables and so on. In Leicester, the situation's pretty bad. I mean, the market is kind of a sad place. Yeah. I'm from the qualitative point of view. I mean, the quality of the vegetables.
One of the better markets. One of the best markets in UK cities. I'd say personally.
One of the oldest, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is some work underway to try and. There's actually a food charter that has been written in Leicester, which is amazing. But yes, it would definitely be that's what slow food advocates, And so from the European policy point of view, I can tell you from the advocacy perspective, Slow Food was really active and had a CAP campaign. There are some leaflets over there. They published position paper, so it's about 25 pages. There's also a 5-page version if you want, and where they highlighted some of the most important aspects according to Slow Food. One of them was the age of farmers. So I think only about 7% of farmers today are under the age of 35.
In Europe.
Yes, under the age of 7%. I mean, that's just crazy. So if nobody's growing our food, who's going to be who's going to be growing our food in the future? And a lot was also about giving young people, particularly with the economic crisis, the possibility of having some land and growing food. And so while there were many hopes, I think, for the CAP, it didn't meet the
CAP.
Yeah, it didn't meet, let's say, the hopes that there were. So yeah, well, I mean, from a lobbying perspective, Slow Food did do a lot. They held events in Brussels. It was called the Good Food March, where all around the country people, look it up. There's a website, and then they organised a big protest outside of the Parliament. They organised a conference within the Parliament, and they've got very good relationship with the Commissioner for Agriculture, who came to Terra Madre last year. He often comes to Bra, for instance. So there is a lot to be done. But I think Slow Food did a good job in raising the profile on those issues. But also, one of the things that I always say is that Slow Food is like it's a big house. It's like an umbrella that just welcomes a lot of people. So you can be vegetarian, vegan. You can be, you can be doing so many different things. But Slow Food just brings all these people together and collaborates with a lot of association, even within the UK, like Compassion World Farming, for instance. Is slow food having an impact compared to big agriculture? So I'm an optimist, so my answer is yes. I think a difference is made on the local level. So, you saw some of the people in the short film, and in their local communities, things are changing, but it's obviously very tough. But on a wider level, I think things are changing. If you look at the types of food you can buy now, even like there's much more talk about organic food, or there's much more attention to reduction of meat consumption, for instance. Local food in my university, for instance, it's a bit mixed, but there is still like a fair attention to local suppliers. Local foods. If you go to restaurants now, there's a lot of attention to. I think you will all have noticed. I don't know what it's like in Leeds.
I've always thought that buying the cheapest food was a good thing. I've always thought that we've got this global market and we're able to buy food from Kenya. We're able to buy green beans from Kenya or flowers from Kenya, and the reason why people buy them is because they're cheapest. They're cheaper. So I don't understand why it's not a good idea to buy the cheapest things from wherever you can. I don't, can you explain why that's a problem?
Food has to travel such long distances when it could be grown locally. It's also got to do with a question of taste, because if you're buying green beans from Kenya, I'm sure they're far less tasty than if if they were grown from 20 kilometers from here, for instance. It's about local economies and local communities. So if you're buying local, you're supporting the local producer. And in some cases, if you're buying at the market, in farmers markets, for instance, you get to establish a relationship with the producer, so with the person who's actually, planted the seeds and has worked the land or has raised the animals from the meat that you're eating, and that completely changes your relationship to food, the way you appreciate the taste. I mean, I remember when I was working, I had the opportunity of accompanying journalists around the area to meet some of the local producers. So I went to one producer. He makes a fresh goat's cheese. So I was there at 6 a.m. with the goats and see all of the process. It was him and his wife, and they're 35 or something. And they just started this a few years ago. It wasn't a family-run business. So I go and buy this food I go and buy this cheese at the market, and I know the goats, And I mean, I know it's not a possibility everywhere. But urban agriculture is becoming very successful. Beekeeping in London, it's exploding. New York as well. So you always have to remember the story behind your food. It changes everything.
Well, there's also another dimension to this question, which is, for example, I'm from Arezzo in Tuscany, which is a town. Among other things, they are good. They produce very good ham. And I went to try to buy some ham from a little town on the mountains, about 50 kilometers from Arezzo. And the guy told me, I can give you some ham, but you have to buy 3 hams. And I say, what? I mean, I just want 150 grams, some slices. And he said, well, look, it's all changed because the Chinese are buying all my hams now. The price has gone up so much, so I can only sell you 3 hams minimum, or otherwise you can't eat anymore. So I mean, and this was me, but I mean, basically the old town and indeed the old valley could no longer eat their own ham because of the ham now being part of a global market of commodities, with the prices that just shot up so much. So I mean, this says something about capitalism. It says something about the crisis of the Italian economy, the changing hierarchy, but it's it felt to me, deeply wrong and troubling that. But by the way, partly because I had driven 50 kilometers to go to this place to buy some ham, because it is really special. But I couldn't buy it anymore. So I don't know. This is perhaps not quite an answer, but it's something that is happening.
Can I just explain the question though? Because countries like Kenya, for example, flowers are now their main foreign export earner. Without flowers, they wouldn't be able to buy things that they need on the global market, like cars and televisions that they can't produce in their own country. So isn't it quite?
You're assuming that the profits go to the Kenyans, but they may go.
Sorry, can I just finish my question?
Yeah.
When you're saying that we shouldn't be buying flowers from Kenya, where are they going to earn their money to buy?
It's a good question.
The things that they need.
Yeah, can we take a few more, and then we go back to the speakers?
I just wanted to answer that question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You want to answer the question? Yeah.
Well, I think that your point's right, and that they need to have a market for their produce. But one of the things that you can lose.
Could you speak up a little?
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah, the provenance of the information about what's gone into your food and who's produced it, so you can lose the ethical dimension of the production. So if somebody's not been paid a fair wage to produce that, then that food can be cheaper. And so can you be more sure that everyone's got a fair deal out of the production if you bought it locally? That might be more expensive. So it's more expensive if you've paid everybody and you've not used child labour or things like that. I'm not saying that that's what happens with flowers from Kenya.
Right.
It's just that does happen.
But if you buy your flowers or green beans locally, those people have no wages. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No. I understand.
Change the economy in Kenya.
Yeah.
So that they do have to be something else that they're doing. But the other problem with not so much flowers, because that's a luxury item, but beans, we just don't know. As climate changes and some areas of the world may become unproductive, and we don't know at the moment which those are. So there's a problem about resilience in that, if you're relying on food that's shipped around the world, not only are there going to be areas of the world which possibly can no longer produce food, but also the means of transport with peak oil and so on may be a problem. So it makes sense to have a robust local food-based economy, which has got as much flexibility within it, so that as the climate changes, there's ways of moving things around so that everybody gets enough food to eat.
Okay.
Basically, I was just going to say the same thing because there's this continuous interest in third world countries having to, produce for them to escape out of poverty, and which is a very interesting question that you say, because without the agriculture, there's no incentive for them to escape this poverty that they're entrenched into. So I thought, it's a very interesting question, and I don't know how you'd possibly help the local communities, because, for example, places like India and so forth now, because of the changing climate and it being a lot drier, the investors who are looking at certain types of rice granules that can grow in drier areas compared to, more irrigated climates. So
that's not the point. It's the export of water. In the Punjab, until 50 years ago, when they first started producing a huge amount of grain in the Punjab to feed India, the water table was about 1 metre below the surface. It's now 80 metres below the surface and falling rapidly. So every bean that you have from Kenya is also exporting water from Kenya, which has been used to irrigate that crop. And it'd be a lot better if the water stayed in Kenya. It was used to grow things that the Kenyans could eat and export, more locally and build a more local resilient economy. I think that's the thinking behind it. I'm no expert.
Okay, we have your question again, and Barry. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to ask just another thing about knowing where food comes from, because I guess sort of everyone in this room is fine. We know that our food is grown, and if we buy it from the supermarket, it's come through a number of stages to get to that point. However, it's kind of a bit shocking that that knowledge isn't anywhere near universal.
Right.
That, you know, I remember sort of going blackberry picking with my cousin's kids who had just no idea. They were kind of freaked out by the fact that you could go and pick something by the roadside and eat it.
Yeah.
And they just didn't know where anything came from other than the supermarket. And that's probably, you know, very, very common. So, what, you know, I know the slow food movement is sort of doing, I've seen some Italian children's books about, you know, where food comes from and what bees do and stuff like that. But is there a good sort of way in that can help the movement grow in the UK that's really about sort of educating people about where food comes from and what it actually is?
And the taste.
Yeah. Okay, that's a question. Barry?
Complicated couple of points, and I hope there's a question there. And I suppose I made me think about the term that used to be used in the food movement about role of agribusiness, which doesn't seem to get talked about so much. And I just wanted to give a couple of thoughts about that. I can't remember whether it was an earthquake in Haiti or it was a typhoon. Perhaps not so long ago, it was devastated and has not recovered. And the problem in Haiti was there's enormous poverty there because the Americans can provide rice cheaper than they can grow on the island. But they could grow rice on the island if there wasn't an unfair dominance of agribusiness in America, which means it gets subsidised in the free market at all. It's a rigged market, which then means people could actually grow their own food, and that would be a start. It would be a help. I'm not saying it would be the solution. I'm not saying they shouldn't have a right to buy things elsewhere, but if they had that safe basis, they might have a basis for development.
Yeah.
And the other is a different example. My ex of many years ago went into the organic food business. When it was unpopular, and I know organic food's got problems and organic companies shops are going out of business at the moment, but it was then seen as a major area of development. Of course, eventually she managed to even get them on the shelves of supermarkets, but then Heinz rang up the supermarket and said, you either take that stuff off the shelves, or we take our stuff off the shelves. Well, tiny little company versus Heinz. But then the interesting thing was actually there was a protest movement which she knew nothing about outside saying we want our organic foods back. And eventually they rang up and said, all right, we'll have them on the shelves, we'll try and calm Heinz down. Heinz now is, of course, owned by what's it called, a hedge fund, is it? A private equity firm now. So it's got even more closed off from being socially responsible. And these are what we're facing. And I just wonder whether, and this is about crude examples for which I apologise, if you like, the slow food movement just does its thing or seeks to make I'm very interested in the Gramsci notion of how you make a challenge, how you prefigure. But does that also not mean a challenge to the social injustices that some of us identify anyway as part of the problem of food production, as well as doing these wonderful things and meeting well and feeling good, all of which is important, I don't want to devalue, in the process, really. I'm just wondering.
I mean, it's just interesting getting this range of views, and you can see that people are here involved in many different kind of movements. And despite, just a general point, despite austerity, because that in itself, or whatever you want to call, the situation in the economic situation, from what people tell me, that the evidence isn't as clear-cut as you might think. You might think everybody's moving back towards, after some flirtation, let's say, with organic or whatever, they're moving back towards cheap supermarket food. But I understand it's not as simple as that at all. That in fact, it's much more complex and more discerning consumers are still sort of sticking to their principles. The point about agribusiness, I agree, and I think this is part of the problem with the Kenyan bean situation, where we know that people are having to leave the land, go into cities, and there's a big agricultural crisis, and the role of the market, property is not social justice. Essentially, it's making profits and so on. So it's people. Where the money's going to, how the system is organised, I think are the questions we need to be looking at when we're thinking about consumption. And I think, to be fair to slow food, certainly in the last 5-6 years, as Terra Madre showed, they're aware of the whole question of seeds and land grabbing and so on. I mean, there is a big concerted effort there. On the question of education, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, there are some good things, going on around food, I think, in Britain. And whatever we think of Jamie Oliver, somebody, many contradictions, nevertheless, he did put on the agenda, I think, the school dinners thing, and it did change policy. And Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, the fish fight.
Although it's reversing again.
Well, I should say, of course, it's being reversed, and the government, and this is a depressing side of the current situation, the government's response to this, the current government, is to put on these, as advisors to the whole health crisis, the representatives from all the big Pepsi, McDonald's, as sort of in what are so-called responsibility deals, where they go in and somewhat irresponsible.
The number of fizzy drinks distributors in schools apparently has gone up since the new government has.
So there is a backlash, but people are talking about it, and I think that's important.
I'm not sure about because I'm not so familiar with the situation. I mean, I know, but about things happening in particular in the UK. I mean, I can tell you what happens in Italy. Food education in Italy for the local slow food groups is really important. There are I don't even know the number. I don't know the number of schools that are involved, but there are many. And but also in the States, apparently in the Denver area, I think now 60% of schools have vegetable gardens, which is incredible. That's also thanks to the chef Alice Waters, and her project is called Edible Schoolyard. But in Italy, it's really successful. Either there are vegetable gardens in schools, or there are actually we call them taste workshops. But they're both for adults and children. But it's really focused on if you think about cheeses, for instance, I always talk about cheese. In the supermarket cheeses that you buy are just really bland, and we're getting used to those bland tastes, and so are children, because they're eating really bland food with no texture, and people aren't used to those cheeses, really aged with a kick, and they would probably be disgusted, actually.
They have worms, some of them.
Yeah, but it's true, and in Sardinia as well.
Like having actual proper red Leicester in Leicestershire.
Did it shock you?
And it's such a different beast.
You can only find it in 2 shops.
Yeah.
No way.
To get it.
So it's about re-educating our senses, really, and there are many projects that Slow Food does in Germany.
Could there be opportunities, because one of perhaps the only good thing that the government is doing in education is this idea of the local educational curriculum, which in theory is about linking with whatever is local history, local resources, and so on. I don't know. There might be something that one can work with.
It would be great. The problem is, from a slow food perspective, that the association in the UK at the moment isn't very strong. As in, there probably aren't the resources to do that kind of thing, or the organisational structure.
Slow Food has this project you mentioned, Presidia, and the Arc of Taste is the initial sort of movement there, where basically do some research on food that's at risk, which is at good quality, and that has a strong connection to a local community. So in Britain, there were artisan cheddar, there were the Cornish pilchards,
the pears,
the Perry pears in the 3 counties Perry.
Mountain Leopard pork pies, I think.
Possibly, I'm not sure about that one.
No, I don't think so. Actually.
And this is a very interesting project. I mean, this is a real commitment to. It's not just about being nostalgic about it. It's about saying this is specific to the territory, terroir, if you like, and we need to build interest in that. We need to sustain, the producers, keep it alive, and find a market for it. And in Britain's not the best example. There have been good stories. This Presidia program is global, and there are great stories where in the Saxon villages in Transylvania I visited, they had these preserves and other things, and it's absolutely crucial to the local economy, and it makes a big difference. So you've got this combination of history, local producers, keeping the next generation going, which is very important, fishing and other things. and you've got this great taste. I mean, it's that mixture of things. So there is the Arc of Taste and the Presidia, and I think they've got something at the moment on forgotten foods.
So we could do something with the rhubarb triangle.
Rhubarb would be an excellent. The rhubarb triangle would be an excellent example. Yeah.
That kind of area.
Yeah.
Is there any other comments or questions? We are perhaps going towards the end.
Geoff, on the question of a local economy.
Yeah.
I mean, all economies, to a certain extent, are local. Everything's grown in a particular place. And what you're saying really is that you'd prefer to buy something from someone who was growing it nearer, closer to you. So it's that sort of distance. So it's like you don't want to buy something from Kenya because it's further away. You'd rather buy if you're in Italy, for example, you'd rather buy a green bean that was grown nearer to you. But I don't really understand that you sort of seem to fetishise distance. Why would you rather buy something from nearer to you? I mean, is it just a sort of local, support the local farmers?
And the quality, and where it's coming from. I think that agriculture is in crisis, and I don't think it would be fundamentalist about it to say that we don't grow bananas here, we should be eating bananas. I think you've got to sort of, but you can buy fair trade bananas, and I think that to be overly fundamentalist, is. But I think that taste. If you believe, food is grown, on farms and not in supermarkets. I mean, I think that's important. And a lot of people say that when you visit a market, community market, farmers markets, it generates. It generates community in itself, and look, supermarkets are designed in particular ways. We know they put the milk here and something else there, and it's cheaper. I think there's a big question a big debating point is when people say it's cheaper. Well, what costs are we including here? Are we including environmental costs? If you go into a supermarket, you invariably come out with things you weren't intentionally going in for. I mean, there's the whole costs of transport, the costs of the way employees are treated. And there's a bigger question of cost, I think, and we need to have that debate. We're not isolated consumers. We're thinking about lifestyles and living conditions, the future of agriculture, the future income and resources of the people you're buying from. I mean, that direct relationship. I've just been on a completely different thing. I've been just reading about the food riots of the 18th century, and Edward Thompson writing about this, and what he called the moral economy of the poor, where in a sense the frequent food riots would take place when the price was regarded as unjust to the local population and accepted almost by those magistrates and other people who are there. They realised that food is, even talking about, ironically, adulterated bread. I mean, it's quite interesting. The old problems never go away, But there was this idea that there's a notion of justice, and food was at the heart of this debate. It's about a vital ingredient of life, and and it's in the whole community society rests upon it. And these riots are almost like a kind of constraint. It was almost people, artisans getting involved in it, and. It is like a constraint on what is acceptable and what isn't. And I think food has those wider connections. I think we see in many ways, economy, environment, locality. And don't forget, some food, as you're saying, it has a particular taste because of the land it's grown in. The notion of terroir, it's very important. Otherwise you lose everything.
It's linked to local traditions. Even in Italy, you have the sagre, which are the big feasts organised in the villages, food festivals, which revolve around one product, that's specifically made in that town. So it's linked to folklore, to songs, and if you don't preserve that, then it's going to be lost forever. But also, this isn't to say that exchange is a bad thing, not at all, because all cuisines are based on exchange. Italian one, I mean, it's so obvious to say the tomato, but it's true. But everything.
In fact, I think on the point of exchange, I think Britain should do much more to do some marketing around some special recipes which have been invented here as a result of the intercultural fusion, between immigrants and local tastes.
Important knowledge.
For example, fish and chips is one, but garlic bread, which is I don't like it personally. It's now become a supermarket product, but it's been invented by Italian or pseudo-Italian restaurants adapting to the British taste.
Yeah.
You don't find it in Italy. The baguette with the butter and garlic inside. So, but, I mean, you know, there are many of these examples which we don't really promote, but they are kind of
Indian food.
You only find them here in Indian
in
restaurants as
Les,
well.
in particular.
Yeah, so
But
that's
also
right.
about the Kenyan green beans, the question is why, and the answer is because it's a system that doesn't work, essentially, and it's a system.
Right.
The way things are working now, it's what slow food is against, you know, and wants to promote a different type of.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a small point, really, just remind me of it. I've just been reading recently about a socialist cooperative that had a bakery in the 1920s in Bermondsey with Alfred Salter, the LPMP and all the rest of it. And why did it happen? Because the bread they could buy locally was not local, was not good for them. And people get cheaper, better bread by doing it themselves. So it's not a denial of the wider, but it's also recognised to re-establish local is also valuable.
Yeah.
You know the people, you know the production, you've got relationships with those. That is an important part. If you haven't got a sense of the local, how can you have a sense of anything else? So people do need to be situated and get some value out of the local, and then maybe they can appreciate that. Otherwise, everything is anonymous. Where's it from? Well, it's from. It's from this agency or that agency, and they're all external, and their motivations are very, very different. If people can grasp locally something about the nature of what's valuable, then that's a basis, I hope, for recognising. Well, how do we reorganise society so that we get more benefits like that?
Yeah.
Not a denial that we don't want things from elsewhere, because that's part of the sharing. That programme was not about being parochial, was it?
No.
That was showing the local and the global at the same time, and that's the power, it seems to me.
In linked with that, I mean, the slow food movement has originated a wider movement called Slow Cities, or Città Slow, which is spelled Cittàslow, which again is kind of worldwide now. It's quite interesting. I mean, you can, I don't know if you want to say two things about it in conclusion, but it's quite interesting because, again, for its conceptual innovation, not so much for its perhaps impact, but for example, one of the innovations is talking of the tourist, not as a consumer, but as a temporary citizen. Yeah. So the tourist has rights, obviously, but also has responsibilities. And if the tourist is included as a temporary citizen, it is likely that the tourist will behave in a more constructive way. So they have these cities which are members trying to have a different tourism policy, for instance, which is quite interesting. I don't know if you want to say something about it and what impact it has had, this Città Slow cities thing.
Many in Italy, several in the UK, actually. Trying to think.
Ludlow was the leader.
Ludlow, Aylsham.
There's more, they're all very small.
Perth, yeah, well, there's a rule. I think you have to have less than 50,000 residents.
That's the rule at the moment. It's a bit silly, I think it ought to be changed.
And quite strict criteria. In order to be classified as a Città slow city, you have to go through this rigorous environmental, traffic-related, all kinds of criteria. You have to meet 30 or 40 of these, I think. But yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's a sort of critique of mass tourism, and it's trying to turn people into more discerning, curious visitors and give them the status of a citizen when they're there, not to be treated as a sort of commodity, which is what mass tourism does. And so I think, yeah, it's another branch of slow food. I would like to make the case for fast slow food as well, which is street food, which at the moment is very cheap, but can be very healthy. And there's some really imaginative street food producers in Britain. I mean, it's I mean, in the Italian case, it's wonderful Sicilian street food. At Terra Madre, always spend a lot of time there. And this is
with the food trucks in the US.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of. I had this conversation with a organic hot dog maker in the US. I mean, it just completely subverts your idea of, so you can change. And so I think that we don't be dogmatic about it, and don't allow the cheap cost equation put you off, the argument, which I think is quite profound. Incidentally, the food program on Radio 4 carries a lot of the on a Sunday and a Monday carries a lot of these. I mean, it's very up to date normally with developments. They have a Food and Farming Awards, which give prizes to, let's say, the most innovative drinks producer. It's a whole category of them, and I think they go out and visit, and there's quite a lot of knowledge there. We do have a rich food culture, actually, in many ways, but deserves more recognition. And to see the wider impact of rediscovering a food culture is important.
Great. Oh yeah, you want to last point?
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
I was going to say the thing about certification and going through these hoops is quite interesting, because where do you see the idea of just being part of a movement and having a certain goal relative to having to get certified on certain things? Because in Leeds we went a little way along this transition thing, and then we decided that we weren't going to go for the full certification. We weren't going to become official. We couldn't comply with all the stuff that they wanted in a city of 750,000 people for a programme that was designed for tiny towns. And then we said, right, we're doing our own thing. We've got these same goals in mind. And do you think that's valid? And how, if so, how could that be seen on a level with, jumping through all these
I
hoops?
think you need a different movement for big cities. It's like it's impossible to adapt slow cities as it is to a place like Leeds. But I think that's kind of interesting initiative. One could think about setting up something.
The other thing you have is the local currencies. You have the Totnes pound, the Brixton pound. The 3 or 4 places use their own currencies where local employer, you trade with local employers. It's a great way of raising the profile of local food traditions. Lewis, I think, is another one. They all tend to be quite dissident. It's little towns with dissident, radical histories. But
Stroud is gone.
Yeah, Stroud, another one. Yeah.
Mold.
Yeah.
Mold. Okay.
Yeah.
All small places.
But the Leeds have one. The Let's Local Exchange trading system
Yeah,
do exactly
version.
the same thing.
Yeah.
But they're very, very niche in each place.
Okay, well, thank the speakers, and there's this kind of free literature except for Geoff's book, which is £10, and on the table at the back there is a thing here for donations, if any. We're not funded by anybody. So thank you very much.